Welcome to Legends of Humanity, the international history storytelling channel, where we bring to life the journeys of extraordinary individuals who changed the world. In today's journey, we explore the life of George Washington, the hero of America, its first president, and a living symbol of integrity, responsibility, and democratic ideals. From a young boy by the banks of the Potomac to the commander-in-chief of the Revolutionary War, and ultimately, the founder of the American Republic. He left behind not just a nation, but a timeless moral legacy for all of humanity. Bloodlines of Virginia amidst the untamed lands of 18th century America, where vast tobacco fields sprawled across the South and mighty rivers like the Potomac whispered beneath, the Golden Sooner Boy was born into a world still waiting to define itself. His name was George Washington. George was born on February 22, 1732, at the Pope's Creek Plantation in Westmoreland County, Virginia. At the time, there was no United States, only 13 colonies under the distant reign of the British Crown. His father, Augustine Washington, was a respected planter and entrepreneur involved in tobacco cultivation and iron mining. While the Washingtons were not nobility by blood, they belonged to the upper social class of colonial Virginia, wealthy, land-owning, and politically connected. From his earliest days, George was surrounded by the rhythm of plantation life, the rustling of tobacco leaves under the southern heat, the labor of enslaved workers, and the endless flow of the Potomac River nearby. But tranquility did not last long. When George was only 11, his father died unexpectedly. The loss wasn't just emotional, it marked a turning point in the boy's life and forged the foundations of the man who would one day lead a revolution. As the second son in a family with multiple children, George did not inherit his father's main estate. This early exclusion forced him to mature quickly. Unlike his older half-brother Lawrence, who studied in England, George remained in Virginia. Deprived of elite education abroad, he had to rely on self-discipline and opportunity, a pattern that would follow him throughout life. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, was a stern and devout woman who raised George with unwavering discipline. She believed that true honor came not from wealth, but from character and responsibility. Under her guidance, George developed a calm demeanor, a deep respect for structure, and a growing sense of duty. He learned to be polite, restrained, and composed virtues that would become trademarks of his later leadership. Though he lacked a formal college education, George developed a strong aptitude for mathematics and surveying. By age 16, he joined a land surveying team exploring the rugged Shenandoah Valley. These experiences weren't just jobs, they were his first real-world education. He slept under stars, crossed rivers, mapped new lands, and worked closely with settlers and Native Americans. The frontier taught him hardship, negotiation, and the importance of observation skills that no classroom could have offered. During this time, George began keeping notes on conduct and civility. One of his early exercises was copying a book titled 110 Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation. Though it might seem trivial, this exercise revealed a young man deeply committed to self-improvement. He believed that manners, restraint, and respect were not signs of weakness, but essential traits of a true gentleman and leader. Virginia, with its blend of aristocratic tradition and rugged wilderness, shaped George in every way. He was not born a prodigy. He didn't possess dazzling brilliance or dramatic genius. What he had was rare: an unwavering character shaped by hardship, a steady mind grounded in moral discipline, and a vision that quietly looked beyond personal gain. No one could have imagined that the quiet boy standing along the banks of the Potomac, surveying the earth with a compass in hand, would become the soul of a new nation. But within his veins ran not the blood of kings, but something greater, a devotion to order, a deep sense of duty, and the seed of a dream called freedom. The rise of ambition. Not all great men are born into privilege. Some must climb, step by step, from the lowest rungs of society to prove their worth. George Washington was one of them. When his father died at the age of 11, Young George not only lost his protector, but also the inheritance and educational opportunities afforded to his half-brothers. In the rigidly hierarchical colonial society of the time, this could have meant the end of his prospects. But for George, it was only the beginning. Denied the opportunity to study in England like his brother Lawrence, George remained in Virginia, humid, untamed land where the aristocracy was still defined by practical strength as much as tradition. It was here, among tobacco fields and dirt roads, that George's ambition took root. He realized that without noble education or inherited wealth, his only true capital would be his character, discipline, and competence. At the age of 16, George received his first real opportunity. Through the powerful Fairfax family, one of the most influential dynasties in Virginia, he secured a position as assistant land surveyor in the rugged Shenandoah Valley. Surveying land at the time was not merely technical work. It was dangerous, physically demanding, and required traversing remote, uncharted territories where wild animals, severe weather, and tense relations with Native American tribes posed daily threats. George didn't flinch. With a compass, a notebook, and quiet determination, he left the comforts of home and entered a world defined by mud, blisters, and perseverance. For months, he traveled on horseback through dense forest, crossed icy rivers, and camped beneath stars that offered no warmth. He learned to take precise measurements under wind and rain, to draw accurate maps by hand, and to navigate landscapes that had never been officially documented. These early experiences not only hardened his body but also shaped his mind. George became patient, observant, and above all, meticulous. He never allowed errors in his notes. His maps were clear, his handwriting sharp, and his attitude professional qualities that far exceeded his age. Clients began to trust him, not because of his family name, but because of his unshakable reliability. Living and working alongside hunters, tradesmen, settlers, and Native Americans, George learned valuable lessons in human nature. These communities didn't care about lineage or status. They respected those who kept their word, acted with fairness, and showed calm under pressure. George watched, listened, and quietly molded himself into someone who could lead without ever demanding authority. One of the most significant developments during this time was his relationship with Lord Thomas Fairfax, the nobleman who mentored and occasionally hosted him. Through dinners, hunting trips, and business meetings, George gained insights into land politics, British colonial power structures, and the delicate balance between loyalty to the crown and the growing restlessness of the colonies. These were lessons no classroom could have taught. Financially, George also began to prosper. As surveyors were sometimes compensated in land rather than cash, he began accumulating property. By his early 20s, he had become one of the few young men in Virginia with independent wealth. Yet, his true rise came not through riches, but through reputation. His integrity, precision, and quiet resolve made him stand out in a society that valued honor above all. Meanwhile, he continued to shape his personal code of conduct. He meticulously copied and internalized the 110 rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation. Whether deep in the wilderness or at a formal gathering, George never wavered from his sense of decorum. He spoke modestly, stood with composure, and never bowed to flattery or intimidation. The Virginia frontier became the forge of a future leader. Through blistered hands and sleepless nights, across unnamed trails and through biting winters, George Washington was molding himself not in royal halls or ivory towers, but in the soil, sweat, and silence of the wilderness. And in those quiet miles of uncharted land, the roots of leadership began to run deep, steady, quiet, and ready for history's call. Trial by fire in the French and Indian War in 1753, a shadow loomed over the North American frontier. Tensions between Britain and France, the two great colonial empires, were reaching a breaking point. Their struggle wasn't merely for territory, it was for the future of the entire continent. Into this rising conflict stepped a 21-year-old Virginian George Washington who was about to be forged in the crucible of war. Because of his surveying experience in the Ohio Valley, Washington was chosen by the governor of Virginia to deliver a message to the French, demanding they withdraw from disputed territory. The mission required George to travel hundreds of miles through winter forests and uncharted wilderness. It was his first brush with diplomacy, international pressure, and the raw unpredictability of military assignments. He completed the mission successfully, returning with a detailed report and a reputation for calm under pressure. Although the French refused to leave, Washington's performance impressed the British leadership. He was soon appointed lieutenant colonel in the colonial militiathus, beginning his formal military career. In 1754, Washington led a small expedition into the Ohio Valley. His first engagement at Jumonville Glen was a brief tactical victory, but one with serious consequences. A French officer was killed, provoking outrage in France. The response came swiftly. A large French force, supported by Native American allies, marched against Washington. Outnumbered and underprepared, Washington ordered the construction of a makeshift Fort Necessity on soggy open ground. What followed was his first real taste of war's brutal chaos. Torrential rain soaked the powder, trenches flooded, supplies dwindled, and morale collapsed. After a long day of desperate defense, Washington was forced to surrender, a bitter moment that haunted him for years. Critics were quick to point fingers, citing the surrender as evidence of inexperience. But those who studied the full story saw something more: character. Washington didn't make excuses. He documented the events with honesty and humility, taking responsibility and showing remarkable composure for a man so young. Despite the setback, Washington remained involved in the broader conflict now, escalating into what would be called the French and Indian War, 1754–1763. He later served under British General Edward Braddock in a campaign to seize French forts. Though he held no formal command, Washington became a trusted aide, valued for his knowledge of the terrain and his counsel. He urged Braddock to exercise caution when marching through the dense American forests. That advice was ignored with tragic consequences. In 1755, British forces were ambushed at the Battle of the Monongahela. General Braddock was killed, and chaos erupted. Though ill and without command, Washington rode into the carnage. He rallied the survivors, organized a retreat, and saved hundreds from annihilation. 4 bullets tore through his coat, and 2 horses were shot from beneath him, yet he survived unscathed. From that day on, his men referred to him as the man who could not be killed. The French and Indian War taught Washington far more than battlefield tactics. He witnessed firsthand the arrogance and incompetence of British leadership in the American wilderness. He saw how colonial soldiers were undervalued and how decisions from across the Atlantic often disregarded the realities of life in America. The seeds of disillusionment were quietly taking root. By the war's end, George Washington was no longer a wide-eyed surveyor from the Virginia frontier. He was a seasoned veteran who had seen the horrors of war, the folly of empires, and the cost of pride. But most importantly, he had learned what it meant to lead not with titles or ranks, but with courage, presence, and unshakable honor. The fire of war had tested the man, and in that fire, something greater than a soldier was born, a leader destined to guide a nation not yet born, forged in smoke and resolve, the hero of Virginia. When the smoke of war finally cleared, George Washington returned to his homeland, not in a blaze of triumph, but with the quiet dignity of a seasoned soldier. Yet, silence could not conceal the rising admiration for the young man who had become a living symbol of courage, integrity, and resilience. In Virginia, the soil that had raised him, where he had once surveyed untamed lands and narrowly escaped death, Washington was now hailed as one of its most honorable sons. Tales of the man who could not be shot down at the Battle of Monongahela spread quickly through military camps and legislative halls. People spoke in awe of the officer who rode calmly through volleys of gunfire, rallying retreating troops and restoring order amid chaos. But what earned even greater respect was his humility after battle. Washington returned to Mount Vernon, his family estate, not to revel in glory, but to resume life as a farmer. Though back in civilian life, Washington did not allow himself rest. He woke early, managed the plantation with precision, read widely, and maintained impeccable conduct in all aspects of life, from his dress to the way he addressed his workers. Despite lacking a university education, he pursued knowledge passionately. He read books on philosophy, law, agriculture, and leadership, copying passages and absorbing lessons with methodical discipline. In 1759, at the age of 27, George Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy and graceful widow with 2 young children. The marriage brought him significant land and social standing, but more importantly, it gave him a partner who believed in his quiet strength and moral clarity. Their bond was not built on wealth, but on shared respect, loyalty, and a deep sense of duty. Washington had no biological children, but he took on the role of stepfather with unwavering dedication. He raised Martha's children with firmness and affection, emphasizing discipline, responsibility, and personal integrity. As a husband and father, he embodied calm authority of presence that commanded respect, not through fear, but through consistency and example. This image of a principled family man would later become a foundation for his public leadership. Following his marriage, Washington stepped into political life. He was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, the colony's legislative body. Though not a fiery orator, he quickly earned a reputation for seriousness, preparation, and a deep respect for the legislative process. He never spoke for the sake of speaking, but when he did, his words carried weight. He stood against injustice without aggression and advocated for liberty without chaos. As tensions between Britain and the colonies began to simmer, Washington's voice remained calm but firm. He opposed arbitrary taxation and British overreach, but he also cautioned against rash violence. His balanced views, expressed through thoughtful speeches and reasoned debate, won him trust across the political spectrum. At the same time, he dedicated himself to improving Mount Vernon. Under his direction, the plantation became one of the most productive in Virginia. Washington adopted innovative farming techniques, practiced detailed record keeping, and implemented systems that reflected both efficiency and fairness. Though slavery remained a tragic reality of the era, Washington's treatment of laborers, while still within a flawed system, reflected a growing moral consciousness that would shape his later views. Through this blend of honor, capability, and personal example, George Washington emerged not just as a war hero, but as a civic leader with unmatched integrity. He didn't seek fame, he never demanded recognition. Yet with every action, every word, and even in his silences, he earned the respect of his peers and the affection of the people. Virginia had seen wealthier men. It had seen more eloquent men. But in Washington, it saw something rare. A leader who lived his values, led with quiet strength, and gave more than he took. The heroism born in battle had now taken root in governance, and the man once forged by fire was now being shaped by responsibility, compassion, and principle. The gathering storm, the 1760s, did not begin with the sound of muskets, but with the dull thud of legislation dropped from across the sea. After the costly French and Indian War, the British Empire, victorious but heavily in debt, turned its gaze westward toward the flourishing American colonies. Parliament saw them not as partners, but as untapped sources of revenue. And so, without consultation, without representation, the first of many laws arrived. The Sugar Act of 1764 was the opening blow-hefty taxes on imported sugar and luxury goods. Then came the Stamp Act of 1765, which required government-issued stamps on all printed materials, from newspapers to legal documents. Later, the Townshend Acts imposed duties on glass, lead, paint, and tea. For the colonists, these were not just economic burdens, they were political insults. They were being taxed by a parliament where not a single American voice was heard. The colonies began to stir. From the cobblestone streets of Boston to the sunlit plantations of Virginia, a single question echoed: were they subjects or subordinates? British citizens or tools of empire? George Washington, then a respected landowner and legislator, remained silent at first, but in the privacy of dinner tables and the quiet corners of legislative halls, he began to speak. He never used incendiary language. Instead, he spoke deliberately, firmly. No people should be taxed without having representation in the body that levied those taxes. Washington did not reject the British crown impulsively. He had served under its flag. He had respected its order and laws. But he also understood that true freedom could not coexist with governance that treated men like children. In one of his rare but powerful statements, he declared, "We ask for nothing more than justice, and we will accept nothing less than the right to govern ourselves." When the Stamp Act crisis erupted in 1765, the Virginia House of Burgesses passed a resolution rejecting Parliament's right to tax the colonies. As a delegate, Washington voted in favor. It was a turning point, his first public stand in defense of American rights. No longer neutral, he stepped quietly but clearly into the ranks of those who believed in self-government. That same year, Washington began supporting boycotts of British goods. He encouraged local production, wearing homespun clothing and avoiding imported tea. Mount Vernon became a quiet manifesto. Hand-woven fabric, herbal substitutes for tea, and transparent ledgers of trade all spoke louder than protest. Washington did not rally mobs. He did not call for rebellion. But when news of the Boston Massacre in 1770 reached him, where 5 colonists were shot by British soldiers, he did not respond with outrage. Instead, he wrote in his journal, "The blood of the innocent shall not be spilled in vain if it awakens a people chained in gilded manacles." His respect for law now evolved into a desire for a new system of laws created by and for Americans. In quiet meetings and increasingly public forums, Washington became a pillar of the growing movement for autonomy, not through slogans, not through anger, but through trust, steadiness, and moral clarity. When historians look back on this time, they may not find Washington shouting, "Independence!" from a podium. Instead, they will find a man who stood like a stone in turbulent water, steady, measured, and unshakable. He was not the spark that lit the flame, but he would become the one who ensured it would never be extinguished. The commander without a crown spring 1775. The skies over the American colonies no longer carried peace. What had once been whispers of resistance had become gunfire at Lexington and Concord, the first battles between colonial militiamen and British regulars. The colonies now stood at a threshold from which there would be no return. Surrender forever or rise and fight for liberty. On May 10, 1775, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. In a modest wooden hall, representatives from 13 different colonies gathered not just to protest, but to shape the future of a people. There was chaos. Militias from across the colonies had surrounded Boston, but there was no centralized leadership. The army was disorganized, poorly armed, undertrained, and lacking everything except resolve. In this moment of crisis, one name was quietly, repeatedly mentioned: George Washington. He did not seek glory. He was not a European-trained strategist, but he had endured the French and Indian War, had learned from defeat, had led under pressure. More importantly, he was a symbol of integrity, humility, and quiet strength. On June 15, 1775, after intense deliberation, Congress voted to appoint George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Upon receiving the news, Washington did not cheer, did not boast. He stood, bowed slightly, and said with genuine emotion, "I accept the command, though my abilities and experience may not be equal to the trust. But I promise, with every power I possess, to discharge this duty in service to my country." He refused a salary, requesting only reimbursement for his necessary expenses meticulously recorded and submitted. From that moment, a man with no army, no money, and no formal authority became the soul of a revolution not yet born. Wearing a simple blue uniform from his Virginia regiment, Washington left the halls of Congress not as a king, but as a servant of a fragile hope. He rode northward not with fanfare, but in solitude, stopping at towns, speaking with common people, listening more than he spoke. At each stop, he was received with growing reverence and awe for titles, but for the burden he willingly bore on their behalf. When he reached Cambridge, Massachusetts, he stood before thousands of men, some with rifles, others with tools, mostly farmers, artisans, and volunteers, who had never seen battle. They looked to him with uncertainty, but Washington did not hesitate. He reorganized the army, assigned commands, imposed discipline. Where there had been chaos, he began building order. With no pay, no overwhelming firepower, no promise of victory, Washington took command of a ragged army held together by faith. He had no crown, but he had the trust of a people. No throne, but the moral weight of leadership. No fancy proclamations, only the quiet gaze of a man who knew this war was not just for land, but for dignity, freedom, and generations yet unborn. Once a young soldier lost in the wilderness, George Washington was now entrusted with the fate of a rebellion. And in the dim light of a newborn struggle, he did not raise his head in pride, but bowed it in solemn commitment to the heaviest responsibility of his life. Valley Forge, the longest winter December, 1777. Snow fell in thick, unforgiving layers over the desolate fields of Valley Forge, a patch of frozen wilderness just 30 kilometers from British-occupied Philadelphia. The largest city in the colonies had fallen to the crown. Now, the Continental Army retreated into the woods not to rest, but simply to survive the most brutal winter of the Revolution. Nearly 0 soldiers gathered at Valley Forge. It was not a fortress, nor a city, only forest, mud, and bitter cold. Many had no shoes, their bloody footprints marking the snow in grim red trails. Tents were few, blankets scarce. Disease spread like wildfire: typhoid, dysentery, pneumonia. Food was nearly gone. At times, men resorted to boiling their leather shoes for sustenance. At the center of this encampment stood George Washington. He did not sleep in comfort. He lived among his soldiers, ate what they ate, froze as they froze. Every day he walked the camp, speaking to his men, hearing their pain, watching hope flicker. Some deserted, some collapsed from illness. But Washington, calm-eyed and composed, as if standing in spring sunlight, never flinched. He penned dozens of letters to Congress, governors, and contractors pleading for supplies, food, clothing. Often, he was met with silence or delay. In private, he expressed frustration, but never did he give up. Instead, he infused his army with something even greater than strength belief. He told them, time and again, if they could survive Valley Forge, nothing could ever break them again. In those frozen nights, Washington became more than a commander. He became a pillar of spirit. He didn't win a battle, but he prevented an army from falling apart. They endured not through rations or firepower, but through dignity and sheer will. Then came a man who would help reshape that will into discipline. Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian officer, arrived with a new idea: structure. With Washington's support, he began training the army from the ground up: drills, formations, bayonet use, battlefield maneuvers. Washington backed him fully. He knew love of liberty alone would not win a war. America needed an army. Out of the snow, from mud-caked boots and frostbitten hands, a true Continental Army emerged, disciplined, trained, and united. There were no cannon blasts, no marching bands, no flags raised in triumph. But Valley Forge was a victory not measured in enemy dead, but in the number of men who still stood. And Washington was the reason they remained standing. He was the quiet fire that refused to die. Years later, many would say, without that winter, there would be no United States. For it was there, in pain and darkness, that resistance was tempered into resolve, and George Washington became something greater than a general, not a god, not a myth, but a man who knew suffering, knew doubt, and still never surrendered. The light of Yorktown by 1781, the American Revolution had dragged on for over 6 years. Small victories, heavy losses, and constant hardship had worn down both sides. Though the British still held major cities, they were stretched thin. Meanwhile, George Washington remained steadfast, quietly rebuilding his army, waiting for a decisive opportunity. That opportunity arrived from across the Atlantic. In 1778, France officially entered the war as an American ally. It was more than a political gesture, it was a turning point. French ships, soldiers, supplies, and seasoned commanders flowed into the colonies. Two names stood out: General Rochambeau, commander of French forces in America, and the Marquis de Lafayette, a young French nobleman whose passion for American liberty rivaled Washington's own. Washington saw clearly the time had come not to defend, but to strike. In 1781, he began secretly planning a final blow. At the time, all eyes expected Washington to attack British-occupied New York. But instead, he chose a different target: Yorktown, Virginia, where British forces had overextended themselves. British General Charles Cornwallis, leading Southern campaigns, had unwisely stationed his army at the coastal town of Yorktown. Washington seized the moment. He orchestrated a bold deception, faking preparations to attack New York while quietly marching more than 600 miles south with combined American and French forces. By September 1781, over 0 troops surrounded Yorktown. Simultaneously, the French Navy under Admiral de Grasse cut off the sea-trapping Cornwallis with no retreat, no reinforcements, and no escape. For 3 relentless weeks, Franco-American artillery bombarded British positions. Washington oversaw the trenches himself, inspecting every cannon, every advance. He didn't rush. He didn't celebrate. Slowly and surely, he tightened the noose until Cornwallis had no choice but to surrender. On October 19, 1781, General Cornwallis surrendered unconditionally. British soldiers marched silently, laying down their arms. Drums fell silent, eyes cast downward. Washington, refusing to revel in victory, simply bowed his head and ordered care for prisoners and restoration of order. He did not seek revenge. He did not humiliate his foes. Instead, he acted as a man who understood that true victory was not domination, but dignity. Yorktown was not just a military triumph, it was a historic turning point. Within months, Parliament in London began discussing peace. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, formally recognizing the independence of the United States of America. And George Washington, once a young surveyor wandering the woods of Virginia, now stood etched in human history as one of its most remarkable leaders, not for his military genius alone, but for his character, patience, and unwavering devotion to liberty. He never sought power for himself. He fought for an idea that a nation could govern itself without a king. From the frozen fields of Valley Forge to the blazing triumph at Yorktown, Washington's journey proved a simple truth. The greatest victories do not always come from the battlefield, but from the soul of a leader who places country above self. The great renunciation, surrendering power. The war had ended. Victory at Yorktown had closed the chapter of blood and sacrifice, ushering in a new dawn for the United States. Yet as the cannons fell silent, a greater question loomed. Who would lead the nation now? George Washington, commander of the Continental Army, revered by the public, admired by politicians, loved by his soldiers, stood alone. He had an army at his command. He held the trust of the people. His reputation towered above all others. If he desired, he could have seized what so many in history had taken before him, a throne. Some officers urged him to become king not for tyranny, but for stability. Others encouraged him to keep the army intact, to pressure Congress into action on back pay and veteran pensions. Their reasoning wasn't wrong. But Washington made a different choice. He knew that if a revolution for liberty ended in rule by the sword, every sacrifice would be betrayed. On December 4, 1783, at Fraunces Tavern in New York, Washington gathered his closest officers for a farewell. In a modest room, he raised a glass and, through tears, spoke softly, "With a heart full of gratitude and love, I now take leave of you. I have nothing to offer but my sincere thanks and deep respect." Then he embraced each man, one by one. Grown men wept. Brothers in arms parted ways. Just weeks later, on December 23, 1783, in Annapolis, Maryland, Washington appeared before the Continental Congress. No military escort, No golden attire, just a weathered blue coat and gray hair turned white by war. He stood tall and declared, "Having now fulfilled my military duties, I resign the commission entrusted to me and return to private life." Silence swept the chamber. They had just witnessed a moment of unmatched moral greatness. A man who could have ruled like a king had chosen instead to go home as a citizen. The shock echoed across the Atlantic. In Europe, where kings ruled by blood and armies, Washington's act was unfathomable. Upon hearing the news, King George III of Britain is said to have remarked, "If he does that and truly returns to his farm, he will be the greatest man in the world." And so, Washington went back to Mount Vernon, not to parades or fanfare, but to the quiet rhythms of rural life. He tended his fields, read books, received visitors not as a monarch or ruler, but as a living embodiment of the republic he helped to create. To Washington, surrendering power was not an act of heroism. It was a necessary step to preserve the purity of the revolution. For a war born in the name of liberty, the peace must be built on the restraint of its leaders. He did not win this final battle with armies. He won it against a far more dangerous enemy, the temptation of power. And in doing so, George Washington became the father not just of a nation, but of a new kind of leadership home, defined not by control, but by character, not by rule, but by principle, not by holding power, but by letting it go. Father of the Constitution. After resigning his military commission and retiring to Mount Vernon, George Washington believed the remainder of his life would be spent in peace among rows of corn, farm ledgers, and the golden dusk over the Potomac. But history had not finished calling on him. For when the war ended, a new and urgent battle emerged, the battle to define a real nation. In the years following independence, the United States remained a fragile confederation. It operated under the Articles of Confederation, a temporary legal framework that gave the central government little to no power. Congress could not collect taxes, maintain a national army, or regulate trade between the states. Instability grew. Internal rebellions flared. The dream of liberty was on the verge of collapsing under the weight of its own chaos. In this uncertain moment, all eyes turned once again to George Washington. At first, he declined. He truly longed for a quiet life. But after witnessing Shays's rebellion in Massachusetts, a violent uprising of farmers over debt and injustice, Washington understood if he remained silent, the young republic might not survive. In May 1787, he journeyed to Philadelphia to attend the Constitutional Convention, summoned to reform the government. Yet instead of amending the Articles, the delegates made a radical decision to create an entirely new constitution, one that would establish a strong and enduring republic. Washington was unanimously elected president of the convention. He rarely spoke. He did not dominate debates, but his mere presence, calm, principled, and deeply respected, held the room together. Over 50 delegates, representing 13 states, with countless disagreements, were bound not by force, but by the moral gravity of one man. He sat at the center of the chamber, listening to every word. When tensions rose, delegates looked to him not for orders, but for balance. One observer noted, as long as Washington was in the room, no man dared put his ego above the future of the nation. Washington quietly supported key constitutional principles: separation of powers dividing government into legislative, executive, and judicial branches to prevent tyranny, civilian control of the military to avoid military dictatorship, protection of individual rights so that no leader, no matter how powerful, could override personal freedoms. He did not write the Constitution, but he was unquestionably its ethical cornerstone. Because of him, opponents compromised. Ambitious men learned humility, and skeptics found trust. When the final Constitution was signed, Washington refused praise. He simply said, "I have done nothing but listen. But if my silence helped, then I am grateful to have been useful." In 1789, when the entire nation called him to become its first president, he accepted not out of pride, but out of duty. Yet it was in Philadelphia in 1000 787, where Washington carved his place not just in American history, but in the history of constitutional democracy. For George Washington was not merely a general or a war hero. He was the man who ensured that no one after him could ever hold unchecked power precisely because he chose not to. The U.S. Constituciona, living document that has endured for more than 2 centuries, the collective legacy of many minds. But at its heart stands the quiet figure of a man who sat at the center of a nation's birth not with thunder, but with stillness, not with command, but with character. The first president on March 4, 1789, the United States Constitution officially came into effect. A new government was born not as a monarchy, nor a dictatorship, but as a representative republic, built on a bold idea, a nation governed by its people for its people. But the question on every citizen's mind was, who would lead this new republic? There was no need for debate, no campaigning, no elections in the modern sense, no fiery speeches. Across the fledgling nation, all voices spoke one name, George Washington. In 1789, he was elected the first president of the United States by unanimous vote of the Electoral College, something that has never happened again in American history. For Washington, this was not a triumph, it was a burden heavier than any battlefield. In a letter to James Madison, he confessed, "I feel as though I am being led to a political tomb. I do not seek power, but if the people need someone to begin this journey, I will accept." On April 30, 1789, in New York City, the temporary capital, George Washington took the oath of office on a Bible, standing on the balcony of Federal Hall. Before a silent, tearful crowd, he delivered a short and humble address. He made no boasts, no grand declarations. He simply referred to himself as a citizen called to serve. Washington's first actions were not to expand his power, but to define its limits. He knew that every step he took would set a precedent for those who followed. So, he voluntarily limited the powers of the presidency to those granted by the Constitution, respected the separation of powers, never encroaching on Congress or the judiciary, chose the humble title, Mr. President, instead of the royal-sounding alternatives like Your Excellency. He understood that the president must be approachable to the people and restrained in authority. A leader, yes, but not a ruler. During his 2 terms, 1789, 1797, Washington laid the foundation for the American executive branch. He established the first federal departments: State, Treasury, War, appointed capable men regardless of political differences, including both Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, who fiercely opposed each other, maintained national unity during a fragile time when the very concept of a republic was still being tested. Perhaps his most enduring legacy was his decision to step down from power voluntarily. At the end of his 2nd term, Washington refused to seek a 3rd, even as many begged him to stay for life. In 1797, he peacefully transferred power to his successor, John Adams. No violence, no coups, no bloodshed. For the first time in modern history, a head of state relinquished power willingly, establishing the most vital tradition of the American Republic, the peaceful transition of power. George Washington was not merely the first president. He defined what the presidency would mean, not as a throne in disguise, but as a role of stewardship and service. He showed the world that power can be great without being absolute, and that leadership, at its best, is grounded in humility, not ambition. From the peaks of war to the corridors of governance, he never let ambition cloud his judgment, and for that, he gave the world something more valuable than any constitution or law: proof that a government can be strong, yet humble, powerful, yet restrained. Holding the nation through the storm toe, lead a nation in war, is a daunting task. But to lead a fragile young republic through the chaos of peace amid division, debt, and global upheaval was the far greater challenge that George Washington faced during his presidency. Though independence had been won, the infant United States quickly began to fracture along political lines. The rise of factions threatened to unravel everything. On one side stood the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, who favored a strong central government, a national bank, and closer ties with Britain. On the other, the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, advocated for states' rights, agrarian values, and sympathy for revolutionary France. Two men who had once served together in Washington's cabinet now clashed openly in the press and in Congress. Newspapers turned into battlegrounds. The government teetered on the edge of paralysis. The American experiment faced its first true political crisis, and in the center of the storm stood George Washington. He refused to take sides. He refused to be a tool of any party. He chose no faction. He chose the Union. In private, he pleaded for unity. He met with both Jefferson and Hamilton, urging moderation and cooperation. Though he could not prevent all conflict, it was his steady presence and moral authority that kept the government from crumbling. But even as domestic politics raged, a greater threat loomed from abroad. In 1793, Europe was engulfed in war. Britain and revolutionary France, the two nations that had shaped American independence, were now bitter enemies. France called on America for support as an ally. Britain warned of consequences if the U.S. intervened. The country was divided. Many called for action. Washington knew the truth. America was too young, too weak, and too fractured to survive a foreign war. He made the most controversial and wisest decision of his presidency. On April 22, 1793, he issued the Proclamation of Neutrality. The United States would not take sides in Europe's conflict. Citizens were forbidden from aiding either nation militarily. Critics called him cowardly, accused him of betraying France, but time would prove him right. By staying out of Europe's war, Washington preserved the nation's independence and stability, giving it time to grow stronger. This moment marked the beginning of America's first foreign policy principle, independent neutrality. Washington believed that peace was not weakness, but wisdom. That survival came not only through armies, but through clarity, restraint, and moral leadership. At home, Washington tackled economic disorder. He supported Hamilton's plan to create a national bank, stabilize the currency, and collect taxes fairly. Though debated fiercely, Washington governed by law and consensus, not decree, always mindful that he was setting precedent for all who would follow. As his second term drew to a close, Washington announced that he would not seek a third term. Instead, he penned what would become his farewell address, not a speech for applause, but a political will for the generations to come. He warned against the dangers of political factions, of entangling alliances abroad, of sectionalism and unchecked ambition. He called on Americans to see themselves as one people, united by shared values, not divided by temporary interests. He not only left office, he left behind a moral compass for the Republic. During his presidency, there were no coups, no foreign invasions, no constitutional crises. And that was his greatest triumph to preserve the nation when it was most fragile, not by force, but by principle. George Washington, a soldier, a farmer, a reluctant president, held the Republic together in its most uncertain hour, with a heart of iron and a mind guided by truth. The Great Farewell in 1796, after 8 years as president, 8 years of laying the foundations of a new nation, guiding America through storms of division and foreign peril, George Washington stood at a crossroads. The people wanted more. Many urged him to stay for a third term, even for life. But Washington saw things differently. For him, stepping down at the right moment was not just a personal decision, it was a sacred principle. He believed that a true republic could only survive if no leader, no matter how beloved, clung to power too long. And so, he announced that he would not seek a third term, a decision that would become one of the most enduring and powerful precedents in American history. But Washington did not leave in silence. Before returning to Mount Vernon, he chose to leave behind a political testament, a letter to the American people summarizing the wisdom he had gained and the dangers he foresaw. On September 19, 1796, the farewell address of President George Washington was published in the Daily American Advertiser. He did not deliver it in person. Instead, he wrote and revised it carefully, with help from Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, ensuring that every word would carry the weight of legacy. It was not a speech of self-congratulation. Washington spoke with humility and concern, like a father giving his final advice to his children. The address centered on 3 timeless warnings messages that remain profoundly relevant to this day. 1. Beware of political factions. Washington warned that partisan politics would divide the nation, turning patriotism into a weapon for ambition. He wrote, "The spirit of party serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration." He did not condemn differing views, but he pleaded for national unity above all else. 2. Avoid permanent foreign alliances. At a time when Europe was engulfed in conflict, he advised, "It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world." Washington did not oppose trade or friendship, but he insisted that America's decisions must remain sovereign and free from foreign entanglements. 3. Put the nation above all else to Washington. Patriotism was not about slogans or symbols, but about upholding the Constitution, obeying just laws, and acting as informed moral citizens. He wrote, "Liberty itself will find in morality and knowledge its surest support." The farewell address was read across the country in schools, churches, and government assemblies. To this day, it is read aloud each year in the U.S. Senatia national ritual honoring the moral wisdom of a leader who chose to leave power at his peak. George Washington did not simply resign. He left behind a roadmap for responsible leadership, a guide for preserving liberty beyond the lifespan of any one person. In doing so, he proved once again that greatness is not measured by how long one holds power, but by how one lets it go, with dignity, foresight, and fidelity to the public good. When he returned to Mount Vernon, there were no parades, just his fields, his family, and a grateful nation. The soldier returns to the mountain in 1797. After 2 terms as president, George Washington quietly left the capital and returned home to Mount Vernon. There were no royal carriages, no grand ceremonies, just ordinary citizens lining the roads, removing their hats in silence as he passed by. They knew they were saying farewell to the father of their nation, a soldier who had completed his final campaign, the battle against power itself. Washington returned not as a ruler in exile, but as a true farmer. He rose early each day, rode horseback through his fields, inspected crops, managed his ledgers, and oversaw Mount Vernon with the precision of a man who had never truly left the land. He wrote letters, read newspapers, and spent quiet moments with Martha, his steadfast companion through war and peace. Visitors still came from all over the world, scholars, diplomats, admirer shopping to meet the man who had once led a revolution. But Washington received them not as a former head of state, but as a gracious host. He served tea, talked of the weather, of agriculture, and only occasionally of politics. Though retired, Washington remained deeply concerned for the Republic. He watched with unease as partisanship intensified, as foreign threats loomed, as national unity wavered, yet he stayed away from power. He knew his chapter had ended, and that new hands must now carry the torch. In his final years, Washington focused on writing his meticulous document that revealed a quiet but profound moral stand. In it, he declared that all enslaved persons under his ownership would be freed upon his death. In a society still bound by slavery, this decision was not made for applause. It was a deliberate, personal act of justice. Without fanfare, Washington made clear that freedom should not be selective. He did not preach abolition, but he lived his principles in silence and resolve. On December 14, 1799, a cold and damp Virginia morning, Washington fell ill after riding in heavy rain. Over the next 2 days, his condition worsened. Though medicine could do little, he remained calm and clear until the very end. His final words, spoken to a loyal servant, were, "I am ready. Do not let my body be disturbed after I am gone." He passed away peacefully in his simple wooden bed at Mount Vernon. News of his death swept the nation. Congress declared a national mourning. Flags were lowered, bells tolled, citizens wept openly, schools closed. Sermons were read in every town. Even in Britain, the nation that once called him traitor, Parliament observed a moment of silence. In France, Napoleon ordered the army to lower its flags in respect. Around the world, leaders and common people alike mourned a man who had never been a king, but had lived greater than most kings ever had. George Washington had lived as a soldier, led as a father, and died as a sage. He left behind a republic that stood on its own legs, not propped up by force or fear, but by ideals. And at Mount Vernon, among the trees and soft winds, there still rests a modest tomb. No crown, no titles, just a name. George Washington, a son of America, an immortal legacy. When George Washington drew his final breath in the winter of 1799, the United States was still a young republic, not yet 25 years old, with no firm borders, no military might, no global influence. Yet in the hearts of millions, something eternal had already been established. Washington was no longer just a man, he had become a symbol. From the towns of the East to the vast plains of the West, from schoolchildren to statesmen, all Americans would forever call him by a singular, sacred title, the father of his country. In Britain, the former enemy parliament stood in silence. In France, amid its own revolution, Napoleon ordered flags lowered in mourning. In Latin America, revolutionary leaders like Simón Bolívar referred to him as the Torch of Liberty. The world did not simply grieve a leader, they bowed before a living principle. That power must be bound by virtue, and leadership must walk hand in hand with humility. Washington never wrote a philosophical treatise. He was not a dazzling orator, but he taught the world through the quiet example of his life. When he could have been king, he chose to serve. When he could have ruled for life, he chose to step down. When the nation divided, he chose unity. When the world demanded intervention, he chose restraint and independence. He did not preach ideals, she lived them. More than 2 centuries later, his name still echoes throughout the United States and beyond. The nation's capital bears his name, Washington, D.C., an entire state in the American West Washington. Thousands of schools, roads, parks, and memorials honor his legacy. The Washington Monument stands tall in the heart of the nation. Solemn and unshakable, no U.S. dollar bears his face without reverence. No president takes office without invoking his name. And whenever the republic trembles, when democracy is tested, Americans remind each other, Washington held the country together with integrity, so must we. His political vision, distilled in his farewell address of 1796, became a guiding star for every generation. Avoid the dangers of partisanship, steer clear of permanent foreign entanglements, always put the interests of the nation first. These were not just words for America, they were lessons for all of humanity. George Washington journeyed through war, politics, and personal sacrifice not to seize glory, but to show what principled leadership could look like. He was not just the first president, he was the first of a new kind of leader who ruled by moral force, not fear, by service, not self-interest. And when the world looks upon his name carved in stone, they do not see merely a soldier or a statesman. They see a choice to live for ideals, to give up power, to remain humble at the height of glory. George Washington is not merely the legacy of one nation. He is an immortal legacy for all humankind. You've just listened to the extraordinary life story of George Washington, the spiritual father of the United States and one of the greatest icons in world history. Subscribe to Legends of Humanity to continue exploring the lives of legendary figures from around the globe, from world leaders, scientists, philosophers, and artists, to the quiet souls who left an everlasting mark on human history. Legends of Humanity, where history becomes an eternal source of inspiration. Thank you for listening, and see you again in our next journey.